Today I'm just going to be reading one of these books I showed off a while ago. I'm recording it with my DVI camera, and I have like it all set up around, so hopefully it's like show the video if you're watching it. But so this is a book I got like fucking 4 or 5 years ago when I graduated from basic training in Fort Leonard Wood. There's like a little shop of books. There's a lady that runs like a bookstore shop stall thing, and this was there, and I think I bought it on the last day. I don't know, it was like oh, I gotta get something to celebrate with all the money I got. But yeah, it's a first edition, 1999. It cost me $75, and again, the cover is Ryoma, Life of a Renaissance Samurai by Romulus Hillsborough. And I haven't really read it since, because I was like, oh, scared. I opened it though. Maybe I didn't. I lied. No, I didn't. I know I looked at it. I might have looked it up actually. But yeah, it was really, back then, they didn't really give us, well, in AIT, it's like where you go to your school for like your actual job. They allowed us to have books, but they only allowed us to have like military adjacent books. So I got a bunch of like military history. I'll put that back on later. History and stuff like that, and like this vaguely connected. And it was like, whatever, fine. I didn't care at that point, honestly. I was already graduating. So let's read the back. So, alright, it's a biography history. That's what's qualifying up here. The founder of Japan's first modern corporation was a swaggering swordsman who packed a Smith & Wesson, an outlaw who led a band of stalwart samurai to overthrow the shogun. And the most colorful figure in Japanese history, his name was Ryoma, which is the title of the first literary biography of this truly Renaissance man to appear in the English language. And a quote by Tsutomu Oshima, chief instructor of the Shotogan Karate of America. Or karate. I don't know how I want to do the pronunciations. Without the genius of Sakamoto Ryoma, Japan would have lost its independence and have been colonized by a European nation over a century ago. Another quote by Sachiro Miyagi, Japan's most distinguished biographer of Sakamoto Ryoma. Of the many heroes who lived and died during the turbulent years leading up to and following the Meiji Restoration, Ryoma was the most deserving of the appellation, quote, a man for all nations. I am very pleased to see the ideas and magnificent human stature of Ryoma presented in English on the eve of the 21st century. And the last quote. In the present age of economical, political, and social turmoil, Japan desperately needs a far-sighted leader of Ryoma's caliber. Hillsborough has woven the elaborate story of Ryoma with pinpoint accuracy and a profound insight into the most exciting period in Japanese history. The author's infatuation with the life of this leader of men is alive on each page of this fascinating book. This was said by Tai Moriyama, principal of the Modern Japanese Language School in Tokyo, and author of several books on Japanese language, history, and culture. And now for the overall summary. It is a cultural loss that a historical figure of such magnificent stature could have failed to gain the full attention of the Western world for nearly a century and a half. It is a tragedy that the general public's sources of information about the era of samurai have, for the most part, been travesties of Japanese history and culture in the forms of popular fiction and movies. This extensively researched life of Japan's most beloved samurai rectifies the situation. And then red, it says, a must-read for anyone who would understand the intricate background of modern Japan. So, that's what it's about. It's a biography of, I guess, Ryoma, who's pushed Japan into the modern age. So, like, I believe it's probably going to be, like, the time period. It's, yeah, before the Meiji Restoration, which is, like, where like, modern Japan would be. Or, like, Imperial Japan from, like, World War II-ish. Well, like, what we would think about as of World War II. That sort of time period. And then just before, it's, like, transitioning from, like, this more, like, samurai, feudal era into the more Western style society. Or structure, I think. I'm just kind of saying shit, I remember. But, alright, let's begin. Oh, there's a little sticker, or whatever the fuck this is. Oh, here's the other summary. Nah, I'm not ready yet. 1999. This book is dedicated to the spirit of freedom and the soul of man. And hopefully you can just put this in the background and chill. Or, because I'm not gonna really like put too much effort to make it visible for you. I'm gonna be honest, I'm sorry. But, you know, it has a map of Japan and then a zoomed in section of the lower islands, Kyushu and Shikoku. And then a map of Kyoto, where I think Neji Castle was, the Imperial Palace, and a bunch of other places nearby. An acknowledgement for a bunch of people. Illustrations. There's a preface, author's note, note on Japanese pronunciations. I have been studying Japanese, so I don't know if I should like actually say them properly or just like do like the American English version of them, you know? Of like how the fuck you say it. I'm just gonna try my best, you know? I'm gonna try my best. Okay. So the prologue. The year was 1867, and Ryoma was beside himself with anxiety. The outlaw samurai was waiting at his Kyoto hideout for an answer to the single most important question in Japan. Would the shogun restore the emperor to power peacefully, relinquishing his family's rule of 2.5 centuries? Or would the great samurai clans of the southwest, imperial edict in hand, declare war on the shogun's military government at Edo, causing chaos throughout the nation and possibly attack from the foreign powers of the West? Waiting with Ryoma were fellow Ronin outlaw samurai who had abandoned their clans to fight for the loyalist cause of overthrowing the shogunate, restoring imperial rule, and fortifying the Japanese nation in the face of foreign subjugation. The atmosphere at Ryoma's hideout was intense. Should word arrive that the shogun refused to relinquish power, Ryoma and his men were prepared to attack Neji Castle, assassinate the shogun, and then cut open their bellies in defiance. But why would the leader of a band of outlaws be among the first to hear the shogun's momentous decision? How could Sakamoto Ryoma, a petty samurai, command the respect of feudal lords throughout Japan? Theirs was a bloody time of the arrival of, quote, black ships from the west, political intrigue, turbulence, and assassination, in which Sakamoto Ryoma, outlaw samurai, pistol-bearing swordsman, freedom fighter, pioneer naval commander, entrepreneur, and statesman, a youth ahead of his time, with an imagination as boundless as the Pacific Ocean, was a leader in the revolution to overthrow the shogunate and form a unified democracy in Japan. Goddamn. And here's an image of him. Sakamoto Ryoma, seated courtesy of Harutaka Miyoshi. I'm not sure how far I'll read, but we'll see until I get bored or until I get a good spot. So part 1, Forging the Dragon. Shit. Blank ships. The polished dark wooden floors of the Hinoa fencing dojo reflected the late morning sunlight which filtered into the room through 4 small windows. The muscular youth wore a pair of wide trousers of dark blue cotton, a robe of the same material, and a quilted vest lined with pillant strips of bamboo. Protective gloves covered the backs of his hands. A shield protected his face. His long hair was disheveled after a hard practice session. His body covered with sweat. At 5 feet 10 inches tall, the youth towered over the middle-aged swordmaster. Armed with a bamboo practice sword, he walked steadily to the center of the floor. The clean smell of sweat calmed him and prepared him for a battle which he knew must end in death. Master and pupil bowed to one another. The pupil slowly raised his sword to face level, his dark brown eyes focused on his master's. His bare feet planted firmly on the wooden floor, his face devoid of expression. He broke the silence with a piercing guttural wail as the master intercepted the attack at a fraction of an inch above his right temple. Master Hinomi, Hino, countered with lightning speed, slashing downwards across Ryoma's abdomen, then up the side of his chest to the base of his jaw. That's all, the swordmaster firmly commanded, and the match was over. And now, had Ryoma not been born into a samurai household, he might never have touched a sword, and certainly would have not been molded into an expert swordsman by age 17. Ryoma's family, in fact, derived from the prosperous sake brewer. In 1770, the sake brewer purchased the rank of merchant samurai, which, although among the bottom rungs of the two-sworded class, was nevertheless included among the warrior caste. This distinction placed the Sakamoto family among the topmost of the 4 levels of feudal society: samurai, peasant, craftsman, and merchant, in the respective order. The samurai, craftsman, and the merchant in this respective. Samurai. What? I'm being stupid. Sorry. Topmost of the samurai, peasant, craftsman, in the respective order. The samurai Sakamoto Ryoma was born in the castle town of Kochi, capital of the great domain of Tosa, as the remaining island of Shikoku, of the 15th day of the 11th month of the 6th year of the era of heaven's protection, or by Western reckoning, November 15th, 1835. According to one legend, Ryoma's pregnant mother dreamt of a fire-breathing beast, half dragon, half horse, which came, quote, flying into her womb. Another fantastic story tells that Ryoma was stirred by his mother's pet tomcat, since the woman was accustomed to sleeping with the furry creature cuddled between her belly and thigh. A third story has it that Ryoma's father thus named the infant because he was born with a face full of moles and hair covering his back. But as these accounts are mere legend, the validity remains an eternal mystery. While the name Ryoma, quote, dragon steed, remains an eternal symbol of freedom. Ryoma's closest companion during childhood was his elder sister, Otome. Though just 3 years older, Otome had raised Ryoma from his 11th year after the death of their mother. Otome was as large as her sizable younger brother and skilled in the martial arts of fencing, wrestling, riding, and swimming. She never despaired of Ryoma, who until the age of 14 had the reputation among his peers as a, quote, runny-nosed, bedwetting crybaby. Ryoma's father and elder brother were embarrassed by his disposition, which was unbecoming of a samurai. When the family was informed by the local schoolmaster that Ryoma was not only constantly bullied by his classmates for his propensity to wet his pants and cry, but that he did not have the mental capacity for scholarship, both father and brother worried that Ryoma was mentally retarded. That's fucked up. Otome, however, decided that Ryoma was not suited for scholarship. That if he was not suited for scholarship, then he would take up the study of swordsmanship. She soon enrolled him at the Hinem no Dojo, a local fencing academy. At first, Ryoma seemed no more inclined for kendo than he had been for intellectual pursuits. He was constantly getting hit with practice swords on the back of his hands and on the side of the head, thrown to the hard wooden floor, at which times he would inevitably cry. After a few months of training, however, a big change began to appear in Ryoma. He thrived on the rigorous practice. No matter how hard he was hit, he would not let loose his grip on his sword. No matter how hard he was thrown, he would not cry. Eventually, Ryoma began developing muscles on parts of his body which had previously been covered with baby fat. By his third year of kendo training, Ryoma had become one of the toughest and most skilled swordsmen at the dojo. The Japanese island of Shikoku, meaning 4 provinces, consisted of just that, with Tosa being the largest of the 4. Tosa was a fan-shaped mountainous province of the temperate climate, which comprised the entire southern portion of the smallest of the 4 main Japanese islands. Kochi Castle Town was situated in the vicinity of Kochi Castle, along the southern border of the domain, just inland from the Pacific. Tosa was one of some 260 feudal domains, or han, into which Japan was divided. Each han was overseen by samurai, ruled by a feudal lord or daimyo, whatever. Sorry. The shogun, head of the Tokugawa family, was the mightiest daimyo of all. He dominated the Japanese nation from his military government at Edo, which was known throughout the land as the Tokugawa Bakufu. In the spring of 1853, Ryoma left his native Kochi for Edo. The shogun's distant capital was the home of the top fencing academies in Japan, and it was at Edo that the young samurai would further his study in the way of the sword. Besides his long and short swords, which he wore thrust through his sash at his left hip, Ryoma carried with him his father's written word of admonition. Do not forget for an instant that loyalty and filial piety are the most important element of your training. Do not become attached to material things and squander gold and silver for them. Do not give yourself up for sensuality. Forget the importance of your country, or allow your heart to become corrupted. 2 weeks after leaving home, Ryoma reached the last stage of the Tokaido Road. The Tokaido was the main thoroughfare which stretched some 300 leagues along the east coast of the main Japanese island of Honshu, between the imperial capital of Kyoto and the shogun capital of Edo. From here, he got his first sight of the sprawling city and the towering white keeps of Edo Castle, the strongest holdout of the Tokugawa Bakufu. Ryoma was overwhelmed by the sheer energy of the city, the crowds, the 2-storied merchant shops of black tile roofs lining the streets, the outdoor tea shops, numerous food stalls, restaurants, and taverns. Here a daimyo was being carried through the streets in a luxurious palanquin of lacquered wood and split bamboo. There, a young woman emerged from a shop, elegantly dressed in brightly colored silk. A Buddhist priest in the black clerical robe and conical basket hat stood nearby begging for alms. A dignified samurai, perhaps a government official, walked down the street, his sword thrust through his sash, his top knot neatly tied and folded over his cleanly shaved pate. Here was a well-to-do merchant, swordless of course, but dressed in the fine silken kimono. A peddler pulled a two-wheeled cart loaded with myriad household items: wicker brooms, straw baskets, wooden ladles, and small bamboo pails stuck out from the top of all sides of the cart, which passed by a musical quartet of three gaily costumed men and one woman. One of them, an old man wearing a long pointed cap, sang passionately to the music of a flutist, a Eisen prayer, and a pounder of wooden blocks. Protocol compelled Ryoma to report directly to the official Tosa headquarters, located at the center of the city near Edo Castle. Each of the 266 feudal lords maintained official headquarters in Edo to house official representatives of the shogun capital. The size, scale, and the number of these headquarters differed according to the wealth and rank of the individual daimyo. The larger Han, including Tosa, maintained more than one official headquarters, each large enough to house hundreds, or in some cases thousands, of samurai. The maintenance of Han headquarters was required by the law of alternative attendance, whereby all feudal lords were obligated to reside in the capital in alternate years. During their absence from Edo, the lords were required to visit their wives and heirs at the Edo residence as virtual hostages, a protective measure used by the central government against possible insurrections in the provinces. There's a lot of hostage taking, if I remember. Due to Ryoma's low social standing in the Tosa hierarchy, he was little concerned with official matters. Accordingly, after reporting his arrival at Tosa headquarters, he went directly to the academy of the celebrated swordmaster Shibasa Takichi, one of the top fencing schools in Edo. Ryoma practiced fencing daily during his first several weeks in Edo. He soon earned a reputation as a promising young swordsman and developed a close friendship with the swordmaster's son, Shiba Jutaro. Then an event occurring one sweltering afternoon in the 6th month of the 6th year of the era of long happiness, which was to change not only the life of Sakamoto Ryoma, but the fate of the entire Japanese nation. On June 3rd, 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy led a flotilla of 4 black ships into Sakami Bay to the port of Uragai, just south of Edo, sparking the greatest uproar in the 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa rule. Perry carried a letter addressed to the shogun from President Millard Fillmore, demanding a treaty between the United States and Japan, when a Bakufu official informed the Americans aboard ship that Japanese law required all foreign affairs to be handled at the port city of Nagasaki in Kyushu. He was told in no uncertain terms that the President of the United States had ordered Perry to deliver his message directly to the shogun in Edo. Perry had nothing more to say, but rather anchored his 4 heavily armed warships just off the coast, as if to prepare for an attack on the Japanese capital. The Bakufu was perplexed. There had been several incidents in the past of foreign ships appearing off the Japanese coast, but this was the first time that a fleet of warships had threatened Edo, the Japanese capital, and in fact had never seen such magnificent ships. 2 were steamers which could move about freely, independent of sails or the wind. All 4 ships were mounted with great guns along both sides, totaling 80 in all, enough firepower to devastate the wooden city. Until now, the Bakufu had been more concerned with preserving its rule than competing technologically with the rest of the world. As long as the government could keep the foreigners out, the rest of the nation would have to abide by the laws it dictated. To prevent would-be insurgents from secretly traveling overseas, the Bakufu had, for centuries, banned the building of large ships. As a result, Japan had become so technologically backwards that it would it was now unable to defend itself from the Western powers that threatened to dominate Asia. Perry's demands for a treaty presented the Bakufu with the greatest dilemma in history. Acquiescence, it reasoned, would lead to subjugation by the West. Rejection, it worried, might lead to a war which it could not hope to win. But the central government also realized that samurai throughout history would demand a war against the evil barbarians who dared to invade the sacred land. Reports of the Opium War in China during the previous decade, by which the British now dominated the great Middle Kingdom, served as an omen of dire consequences to the Japanese. The shogun's senior council, to be sure, was scared out of its wits. From now on, it would gradually adopt an official stance of opening the country, while samurais throughout Japan would scream for expelling the barbarians. Ryoma, for his part, displayed his own contempt for the foreign intruders in a letter to his father. Quote, "It looks like we're going to have a war soon," he wrote. "If so, I'll be cutting off some foreign heads before returning to Tosa." Before Ryoma could fulfill his vows, however, the Americans had suddenly raised anchor and departed just 6 days after their first appearance off the Edo coast, but not before Perry had received the Bakufu's promise to answer the demands for a treaty during the following year. A treaty between the United States and Japan was completed in March 1854, ending over 2.5 centuries of Japanese isolation. Although the treaty made no provisions for foreign trade, it enlisted American ships to purchase food and other necessities from Japan, and assured them amicable treatment in case of shipwreck off the Japanese coast. 2 Japanese ports were opened, one at Shimodo, just a short distance from Edo, and the other one at Hakodate, on the distant northern island of Ezo. While marking a turning point in history of Japan, the treaty also aroused in the heart of the 18-year-old Sakamoto Ryoma his first feeling of resentment towards the Bakufu, which had been humiliated by the Americans. Ryoma, like most samurais throughout Japan, resented the intrusion of the unwanted foreigners, deplored the shogun's government for having become too weak to keep the foreigners out. Until now, Ryoma's personal development had been focused solely on the forging of his draconic spirit through intense training in the way of the sword. Now, with the coming of the black ships, he was beginning to formulate his first political outlook on the world, albeit was still one which needed a great deal of refinement. Ryoma made a great progress at the Chibiya dojo, receiving intermediate rank within a year. Rank in the Hakushin Ito style was divided into 3 ranks: basic, intermediate, and senior. The attainment of senior rank was tantamount to mastering the art, thus qualifying a swordsman to establish a fencing dojo of his own. But Ryoma's official permission to remain in Edo expired in the summer of 1854, when he returned home. At Kochi Castle, he could not keep his mind off the great American warships he'd seen in the previous year. He fantasized that one day he might command his own black ship. Then one day, in hopes of finding a sympathetic ear, he paid a visit to the Kawada Shoryu, an artist and scholar of Western studies who lived in the castle town. Aside from his many paintings of his many drawings in Chinese, ink dragons were his specialty. Shoryu, whose name meant little dragon, was a prolific writer. Among his work was an account of American castaway about a young Tosa fisherman, Nakahama Manjiro, who had been shipwrecked off an uninhabited Japanese island in 1841. The 14-year-old boy was rescued by an American whaling ship, befriended by the captain, and taken to the United States for an education. Upon Manjiro's return to Japan in 1852, he was ordered by the Lord of Tosa to report his American experiences to Shoryu, who wrote a fascinating account of Western technology, society, and culture, which since the coming of Perry in the previous years, had become an object of extreme interest not only in the local Tosa government, but in the Edo Bakufu as well. When Ryoma first appeared at the front gate of the Shoryu's house, the sophisticated scholar showed no interest in the uneducated young swordsman. Ryoma was dressed softly in a pair of faded gray wide trousers, or hakama, and a wrinkled black jacket. Displayed in white on the front of his jacket was the Sakamoto's family crest, a Chinese bellflower enclosed by the overlapping squares which formed an 8-pointed star. Through his sash on his left hip hung his long and short swords. On his broad forehead, just above left brow, was an unsightly wart. His large tanned face was spotted with moles, and, as usual, his hair was unkempt. "My name is Sakamoto Ryoma. I've heard about your interest in Western culture," he said in short, abrupt words, his right hand tucked into the breast of his kimono. "What do you want?" Shiryu asked impatiently. "I've just returned from Edo. I've seen the black ships with my own eyes." "So what?" "So..." Ryoma paused momentarily before blurting, "I've come to ask you what you think ought to be done about the barbarians." "I'm just an artist. I have no opinion on the matter," Shoryo lied, but Ryoma was persistent and eventually convinced the scholar to invite him inside to discuss Western culture. Ryoma was a good listener, and Shoryo, once he began speaking, poured forth his knowledge of the West. He told of the leaps and bounds by which Western countries were progressing in the fields of science and industry, the practical use to which technology was being put both militarily and industrially, and of the concept of the joint stock company. "As for all the recent talk of expelling the barbarians," Shoryo said, "we simply don't have the means by which to enforce it. You said you've seen the black ships. Well, those are only the beginning of what's to come in our near future. Narrow-minded men who nowadays are inclined to rant and rave about keeping the foreigners out are simply ignorant of the technological power of the West. But that doesn't mean that we should run blindly into a policy of opening the country either. Before opening the country, and that's what we must do if we expect to protect ourselves from foreign subjugation, we must first prepare ourselves militarily. To do so, we must import the advanced military methods and technologies of the West. Being an island nation, Japan is going to have to develop a navy. But before we can do that, we must increase our knowledge of the navigation to do so. To do so, we will need to purchase foreign ships. The little junks we have now are like children's toy compared to the great warships of America and Europe. The Americans have built roads made of iron nails that span a distance much greater than the entire length of Japan. On these roads, they run steam-powered locomotives to transport men and cargo." "Locomotives?" Ryoma interrupted. "What's a locomotive?" "A locomotive is a self-propelled vehicle made of iron, which runs on steel rails and pulls other cars behind it. But we need more than locomotives. But what we need more than locomotives are steamships, with which we could transport passengers and cargo along the coast of Japan. In the process, we could raise funds to buy more steamships until we have developed a small navy. All the while, we could be improving our navigation skills. But unless we get started very soon, it's going to be too late." Shoryo paused to take a deep breath. "This is the only way to save our nation from foreign subjugation." He grimly concluded, "We don't have the luxury of time to argue amongst ourselves whether we must open Japan or keep foreigners out." Ryoma left Shoryo's house fascinated by what he heard, but in his heart still felt that expelling the barbarians was the only policy that a man of integrity could support. Yielding to the foreign demands would be cowardly, he thought, unbecoming of a samurai, but Ryoma realized that Shoryo was right. Japan simply did not have the military means by which to defend itself from a foreign invasion. It was pouring rain when Takechi returned to Tosa Han headquarters in Edo. His hakama was drenched, but a wide conical basket had kept his face and upper body dry. At 6 feet tall, Hempeta, how do you, like, this doesn't make sense. I've never seen this kind of spelling. Hanpieta, it's because the E and the I. I'm sorry. Carried his tightly knit frame with the dignity of a highly polished swordsman. As he proceeded calmly through the iron-studded oaken double-otter gates of Tosa headquarters, Takichi Sensei called a voice from the guardhouse at the gate. Inside were several young men who had been waiting for Han Pieta to return. These lower samurai of Tosa idolized the charismatic swordsman at whose fencing dojo at Kochi most of them had trained before coming to Edo. "What's the matter?" Han Pieta asked, sensing something was wrong. "A samurai named Sakamoto Ryoma had just arrived today," one of the men said. "He's been assigned to your room, Sensei." Han Pieta entered the guardhouse to get out of the pouring rain. "So, Ryoma has finally arrived?" Han Pieta Ita said, removing his basket. "I've been expecting him. His older brother wrote me that he'd be coming, but Sensei, Sakamoto has referred to you in the most insulting way. He's been calling you..." The man paused. "I'll say it. Fishchin," the man grimaced. "We can't forgive the outrage," insisted another man angrily. "Never mind," said Han Pieta, shrugging. Han Pieta was a model of samurai temperance. He was known throughout Tosa as a skilled swordsman and accomplished Confucian scholar. He had been initiated in the Eto style of fencing 3 years ago at the age of 24, when he established his own academy in Kochi Castle Town. It wasn't long before this petty samurai had attracted some 80 followers from among his social peers, all of which referred to him with the honorable title of Sensei. Since coming to Edo in the previous summer, Han Pieta had been practicing at one of the three greatest fencing schools in the capital. This was the dojo of the renowned swordsmaster Monoi Shunzu. Likewise, Ryoma, who had returned to Edo in the fall of 1855, continued his practice at the Chiba dojo throughout the first year of 1857. One afternoon in the late summer of that year, Ryoma returned to his barracks room to find Han Pieta waiting for him. Despite the great contrast in their natures, the two had developed a close friendship over the past year. Han Pieta wore a light cotton robe. His hair was combed neatly and tied in the top knot, which was folded over his shaven pate. He was sitting on the floor in the formal position, back straight, powdering the blade of his sword. "A samurai must always be ready for battle," he told Ryoma. His pale face was expressionless, save his powerful, dark eyes. "Don't you ever relax," Ryoma said, leaning back against the wall. "Powder your sword," Han Pieta demanded, handing Ryoma a small box of powder. Later, Ryoma muttered, "I'm too tired now." "Ryoma, we must prepare for war. Haven't you heard about the barbarians in the Shimodo are pressuring the Bakufu to sign another treaty? During the previous summer, the American envoy Townsend Harris had set up the first United States consulate in Japan in the port village of Shimodo to negotiate a commercial treaty. However, before the Bakufu could sign such a treaty, protocol demanded that it obtain sanctions from the imperial court in Kyoto. The imperial court, however, has been excluded from the business of government for 2.5 centuries. The founders of the Bakufu had designed countermeasures to prevent contracts, both politically and socially, between the feudal lords and the both politically and socially between the feudal lords and the court. Through the years, however, Bakufu's supervision of the imperial court had waned. Meanwhile, the principal outside lords, descendant of those daimos who had become retainers of the first Tokugawa shogun, only after he had defeated his enemies some 2.5 centuries before, namely Tosa, Chosu, and Satsuma, had formed matrimonial alliances with families at court. These alliances would prove important during the revolutionary years of the 1860s, when the Bakufu would begin to crumble. With internal trouble weighing heavily upon the nation, the fencing academies in Edo developed into centers of anti-foreign and consequently anti-Bakufu sentiment. The men training at these schools resented the Bakufu, its weakness in dealing with foreigners. As the commercial treaty with Harris began to materialize, samurai throughout Japan assumed an increasingly hostile attitude towards the Bakufu. The royal support now focused on the imperial court in Kyoto. Emperor Kome himself harbored blind hatred for things foreign. When the Bakufu petitioned for imperial sanctions for a commercial treaty with the Americans, they were flatly refused. Although the emperor held no political power, his prestige of ancient times had not diminished. The first Tokugawa shogun, in fact, had only attained his rank after being conferred by the emperor with the official title of Commander-in-Chief of the Expeditionary Forces against the barbarians. "All right, fish chin," Ryoma said, making fun of Hanpeta's protruding chin. "I'll powder my sword." Ryoma drew his sword from its black lacquered sheath and began applying the lubricating powder. "This is no laughing matter, Ryoma," Hanpeta admonished. "We must prepare for war." In the autumn of 1857, Ryoma was appointed head of the Shiba dojo in the following January, 5 years after entering the dojo. He received the coveted senior rank in the Hakushin Ito style. He was still only 22. God damn. This was the 5th year of the era of peaceful rule, 1858 by Western reckoning. One of the great difficulties for the Tokugawa Bakufu, the military government faced two critical problems: dealing with increased foreign demand to open the country to commercial trade, and deciding on an heir to present to the present shogun. After signing the first treaty with the United States in 1854, Japan had been pressured into similar treaties with Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Russia. None of these 5 nations, however, were satisfied with the initial treaties, which did not provide for trade with Japan. Concerning the problem of the shogunal succession, the Bakufu was in desperate need of a new leader, and in these extremely critical times, the present shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu was mentally retarded. One of the favorite pastimes of the commander-in-chief of the expeditionary forces against the barbarians was stewing potatoes with women in the inner palace of Edo Castle. And since Shogun Isada had no interest in the opposite sex, he was challenged at the age of 35, presenting the Bakufu with the difficult problem of deciding on an heir to his rule. Within the Bakufu, those two opposing positions concerning succession, one on the side were the 145 hereditary lords, director trainers of the shogun, whose ancestors had supported the first Tokugawa shogun during the Great Wars at the turn of the 17th century. These lords, who occupied all the important government posts, were most concerned with maintaining the existing order of things to protect themselves. They argued that shogunal succession must be decided according to tradition, and thus must be given to the child Lord of Ki, a close relative of the shogun. Opposing the hereditary lords was a small group of practical daimyo, who argued the succession to be given to the more able Lord Yoshinobu, the son of the Lord of Mito. The clans of Mito, Ki, and Owari, the elite 3 Tokugawa branch houses, descended from the 3 youngest sons of the first Tokugawa shogun. In the event that shogun failed to produce an heir, succession came from one of these elite houses. Mito, however, had been traditionally excluded from succession. The Lord of Mito, Tokugawa's Nariaiki, blah. I'm opposing it, was nevertheless determined that his son should succeed the shogun. The Mito faction argued that although the Lord of Ki was indeed a close relative of the shogun, at age 12 he was simply too young to rule. After the death of the present shogun, these lords hoped to modify the Bakufu through the selection of an able heir. They would unify the nation through the formation of political coalitions within the Bakufu, which would consist of the lords of the greatest domains in Japan. The conservation hereditary lords who were advocating maintaining the 2.5 century of old Tokugawa hegemony bitterly opposed them. The Lord of Mito was a staunch exclusionist who supported the policy of expelling the barbarians. Opposing him was a powerful man by the name of Ii Naosuke, Lord of Hikone, the largest of the hereditary Han. Lord Ii advocated a period of trade with the West in order to allow Japan to strengthen itself financially and technologically. He argued that this was the only way that the nation would be able to perfect its defense against subjugation. Amid this turmoil, Edo's advancing schools continued to attract samurai from all over Japan. The pending problem of shogunal succession and the Western threat were the topics of the day, with anti-foreign seclusionism being passionately embraced by these young swordsmen. At the center stage of political discourse were three of Edo's top fencing schools. The Chiba Dojo, Sakamoto Ryoma was the head. The Momonoi Dojo, Takiichi Hanpeta was the head. And the Saito Dojo, Katsura Gogoru head. Ryoma took little interest in the complicated affairs of the state, but rather continued to dedicate himself to kendo. Having recently been officially instated in the Hokushin Ito style, Ryoma now enjoyed a reputation as one of the leading young swordsmen in the capital. One evening in late April 1858, Hanpeta was reading a book titled A History of Japan, waiting for Ryoma to return to their barracks room. Upon Ryoma's return, Hanpeta closed the book and placed it on his desk. Hanpeta's facial expression was typically void of expression. "Ryoma," he said, "have you heard of what has happened today?" "No." "You haven't heard about the biggest disaster of our time?" "No." The Lord of Hikone, Ie Naosuke, has been named Bakufu regent. So, is that all you can say? Hanpeta was annoyed at Ryoma's lack of concern for political affairs. "Ryoma, you better start educating yourself. As the head of the Chiba Dojo, you have a special duty to be aware of what's going on in our nation. The Bakufu is too weak to oppose foreign demands. Lord Nariaki of Mito is one of the few men in Edo with the nerve to stand up to the Bakufu. He calls for absolute refusal of the foreign demands to open our nation." "Hanpeta," Ryoma interrupted, "I've been thinking about all this talk of expelling the barbarians. How does anyone expect to be able to do that with just a bunch of talk? I've seen the black ships. Those guns could do a lot of damage. We'll need more than just philosophy to stop them." "That's true, but with the Bakufu giving in to the demands of the filthy barbarians, Lord Nariaki has decided to seek support from the imperial court at Kyoto, which had been completely cut off from governing for centuries." "The imperial court?" Ryoma repeated with a puzzled look. "Yes, because the imperial court shares Lord Nariaki's views. The Lord of Mito had become a natural leader for the samurai who were perfecting their skills in traditional martial arts. Unfortunately, however, most of the prominent proponents of exclusionism, though educated in Japanese history, literature, and traditional Confucian philosophy, remain ignorant of the West, and so consequently had no idea what they would be up against in case of war. The same was true with the court nobles, and even Emperor Gomei himself. But the Bakufu had also requested imperial support, Hanpeta continued. "Why?" Hanpeta explained that the Bakufu had recently panicked upon hearing news of the continued Western advances in China. Edo was consequently persuaded by the United States to agree to a commercial treaty before Japan would meet a similar fate. But Hanpeta continued, since it is recorded by law that the Bakufu would secure imperial sanction for foreign treaties, Edo had turned to Kyoto for support. Why does the Bakufu need imperial sanction? Ryoma asked. Because of the law requiring imperial sanction. Without such sanction, the Bakufu would have trouble getting support for treaties from the daimyo throughout Japan. But Hanpeta's eye lit up. This means that Kyoto is in the process of replacing Edo as the center of national politics. The Mido faction claimed that the shogun was merely an imperial agent who was at the beginning of the 17th century had been compromised by the emperor to protect Japan from foreign invasion. The imperialists insisted that the true political authority still belonged to the emperor in Kyoto. They argued that since the shogun was no longer able to keep foreigners out, the emperor and his court must be restored to power to save the nation. As a result, the national government was gradually developing into a twofold structure. While the Bakufu continued to rule at Edo, the ancient imperial court was undergoing a political renaissance at Kyoto. With this came the political education of young court nobles in Kyoto, who throughout the entire region of the Tokugawa had been completely excluded from national affairs. Even the emperor himself was a political novice. He harbored no anti-Bakufu designs, and his chronic xenophobia was due to a fear of things Western brought on by ignorance of the outside world. A look of disdain flashed in Hanpeta's eyes. Word has it that His Imperial Majesty has been deeply grieved over the course of recent events. Since its establishment, the Tokugawa Bakufu had justified its rule by claiming to ease and protect the emperor, handling all governmental affairs for him. However, things had suddenly taken a drastic turn. The imperialists now held the shogun responsible for dishonoring and upsetting His Sacred Majesty through failure to deal firmly with foreigners. This is a crime that cannot be forgiven, Hanpeta said. He paused, took a long, thin, wooden stemmed pipe from his desk, filled its small brass bowl with tobacco, reaching into the nearby brazier with a pair of wooden sticks. He picked up a burning coal. He lit the pipe and resumed speaking. At first, some of the senior officials at the court were persuaded by convincing Bakufu officials to receive imperial sanctions to open the country to foreign trade. But then, some of the younger nobles organized a protest meeting, and the sanction was recalled. The court instructed the Bakufu to continue being faithful to the existing Tokugawa institution. It argued that violation of the sound law handed down by the first shogun would disrupt the people and make it impossible to preserve lasting tranquility. Hanpeta paused again to smoke his pipe. Being forced into further treaties with the barbarians would be a disgrace to our national honor. Hanpeta continued bookishly. And thanks to the wisdom of the Sacred Majesty, Edo's devious request for imperial sanctions has been refuted. But Hanpeta pounded his fist onto the desk. Just today, Lord E was appointed regent to the most powerful post in the Bakufu. Hanpeta tapped the ashes out of his pipe into a short wooden ashtray, and so he said, his dark, penetrating eyes seething. Although the Bakufu would like to open the country, the imperial